Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and this morning I woke up, I checked my phone, and things completely changed for the NBA yet again with the news that Anthony Davis has now officially requested a trade from the New Orleans Pelicans. Now, to be fair, this isn't entirely breaking news because we've all kind of assumed that eventually Anthony Davis would be leaving New Orleans, and especially once he hit free agency in 2020. But this is a very official trade request from Anthony Davis directly to the Pelicans, so it is now known that he's no longer interested in playing for the franchise. And with this official request, things have once again changed completely in the NBA, literally overnight. There are so many things to talk about with this in terms of the timing of it all, possible trade destinations, and just the impact of this on the rest of the league. So with all that said, let's just go ahead and get started. The first thing to talk about here is, like I said, just simply the timing. I think most of us expected this trade request to go down at some point before he hit free agency in 2020, but me personally, I expected it to happen in the offseason. The Pelicans had the right to offer Anthony Davis an extension, and a supermax extension at that, more than likely, and that would have given them a bit of an upper hand over other teams in 2020 free agency, simply because they would have been able to offer him more money than anybody else. So the timeline that I had in mind for this was that the Pelicans would play out this season with Anthony Davis on the roster. They would try and make the playoffs, which is something that isn't really going too well right now, as they have the third worst record in the West. And then in the offseason, they would offer him an extension, and if he turned it down or gave them an indication that he would turn it down, then that would cause the team to more seriously start looking at trading away Anthony Davis. But instead of waiting until then, apparently he has already made up his mind and wanted to go ahead and tell the team of his intentions, similar to how Paul George did when he was with the Pacers, so that they could get some value back for him and just let them know ahead of time and before the trade deadline this year that he does not intend on staying with the team moving forward. And really, the timing of all this is the core of this video and the core of the impact that this has on the rest of the league, because I think most people, myself included, did expect Anthony Davis to eventually be moved, but now we're facing the possibility that he could be playing for a different team within the next 2 weeks. And the team that affects most immediately, other than the Pelicans obviously, is the Boston Celtics. It's well known that they cannot trade for Anthony Davis this season because they have Kyrie Irving on their roster, unless they included Kyrie in any trade package. So they cannot make this move, which they've been rumored to be interested in doing for a while now, at least until Kyrie signs a new contract this offseason, either with the Celtics or with a different team, or if they trade Kyrie Irving in a different move or in a move for Anthony Davis. And it's also pretty well known that for basically any trade across the entire league for any star, the Boston Celtics have the biggest war chest of assets to try and make that move if they wanted to and if they were motivated to. And because of this timing, it allows some other teams to potentially get in on the sweepstakes for Anthony Davis in a trade scenario, because the Boston Celtics kind of have their hands tied for a while. And so really, basically any team right now has the opportunity to trade for Anthony Davis, because there are a handful of teams that do have a good amount of assets to throw their way, but a lot of them don't really solve his I want to play for a contender issue. Teams like Chicago, teams like Dallas, teams like maybe even Brooklyn. It doesn't really solve his I want to play for a championship every year issue that he has with New Orleans to be traded to those teams. And really at this point, it's pretty difficult to try and guess on which team he would be traded to outside of obviously the Lakers or the Celtics, because pretty often these things come as a bit of a surprise in terms of where these guys end up being moved. If we're looking at recent precedent with the Toronto Raptors trading for Kawhi Leonard and the 76ers trading for Jimmy Butler, those were teams that were kind of in the mix but weren't really at the top of the list initially, and then all of a sudden things just started to come together. And speaking of Toronto, they are, to me at least, the most interesting team in this entire scenario, because I do think they have a package that they could put together depending on how aggressive they want to be. They do have some things that could interest the Pelicans, and with them already basically going all in with the Kawhi Leonard situation, knowing that he's going to be a free agent this offseason, why wouldn't they just go ahead and go all in on trying to trade for Anthony Davis as well? For example, what would the Pelicans say if the Raptors called them up right now and said, we'll give you Jonas Valanciunas, Fred VanVleet, OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, and our 2021 and 2023 top 5 protected first round pick in exchange for Anthony Davis? If the Pelicans are still interested in pushing for the playoffs this season, this could be a deal that would help them do that. All 4 of these players are very, very good players and could be a big part of their rotation. If that's not what they're interested in and they want to look more towards the future, then all of these players are still fairly young, and 3 of them provide pretty significant value moving forward. The only one that I'm thinking doesn't really is Jonas Valanciunas, not because he's bad or because he's too old, just because the other three are simply better assets, in addition to obviously getting the picks. Now for Toronto, this is a pretty big risk because, like I said, you don't really know that Kawhi Leonard is going to come back this offseason. And then even past that, you don't know if Anthony Davis is going to come back in 2020, and you're giving up picks well beyond that. But the reason they have to do that is because they traded away their 2019 to get Kawhi Leonard, so they have to alternate when they give away their own first-round pick. Now, I will say initially, this probably doesn't get it done. I don't expect the Pelicans to be in this much of a hurry to try and move Anthony Davis, which I'm going to talk about here in a little bit. But I do think it's interesting to look at teams like Toronto, given the fact that Boston isn't really involved in this at the moment, and some Lakers things that I'm going to talk about in a second. I think primarily it's important to focus on some of those other teams that maybe we haven't considered previously to be involved in the Anthony Davis sweepstakes because of the circumstances of both the Lakers and the Celtics. And speaking of the Lakers, you know that we have to talk about them if we're talking about Anthony Davis. It's been pretty assumed for a while, especially since LeBron signed with the Lakers, that it's between the Celtics and the Lakers moving forward in terms of the favorites to land Anthony Davis in the future, whether it be trade or free agency for the Lakers. But the problem with this is this kind of puts LA in a bit of an awkward situation, because the plan always was, when LeBron signed with LA, the plan always was to play through this season with LeBron being the only, big time star player on the roster, to try and sign one or two guys in 2019 free agency, and then hopefully at that point Anthony Davis would have requested a trade, and then they could move some of their young pieces to trade for him and have a 3 or 4 core group of star players for the Lakers. But now things are kind of accelerated a bit, because if the Lakers get the indication that Anthony Davis is going to be moved before the 2019 trade deadline, then their options are to either get involved and start trying to give away some of those young players a little bit early and take up some of their cap space with Anthony Davis' current deal as well as his extension in 2020, or they can wait it out and see if they can sign him in 2020 once he is either traded or if he sticks it out in New Orleans. Now, that doesn't mean the Lakers definitely aren't going to trade for AD or aren't going to end up with him moving forward, but they are in kind of a similar situation to the Celtics in that, in terms of an immediate sense, their hands are a little bit tied. Now, certainly not so much as Boston because of the Kyrie Irving situation, but because of their own plans and kind of what they had in mind for eventually getting Anthony Davis, more so than getting him this season. Now, there is a chance that the mid-season timing of all this does cause them to move Anthony Davis before the deadline, and some of these other teams start lining up with big-time offers because they know that Boston and LA are in a bit of an awkward situation. But I think the Pelicans also know that those two teams offer them the most in terms of young players, in terms of draft picks, in terms of assets in general. I think the Pelicans are very well aware, because I would imagine they've been somewhat preparing for this on some level. I think it's pretty clear that it's either the Boston Celtics or the LA Lakers in terms of trade possibilities and what the Pelicans would get the most out of. And it's also important to keep in mind that the team does have him under contract for next season. He's a 2020 free agent, not a 2019 one, and that means that they do still hold a significant amount of leverage in terms of when they do move him. And so with that in mind, and kind of wrapping together all the points that I've made, I wouldn't expect Anthony Davis to be traded before the 2019 trade deadline unless it is some crazy scenario involving a team like Toronto that's able to pull together some assets, maybe potentially in a 3-team deal to get even more assets, that the Pelicans just see it as an opportunity to go ahead and move on this. Toronto wants to go all in, or a similar team like that, before really Boston and LA are all that much into the sweepstakes. I think that kind of timing does shift the scales a little bit more towards teams outside of those two. But again, I would expect this to happen more towards after the draft and after free agency than I would before this trade deadline. And even after all that, even after he's traded, it also has to be considered that there's no guarantee that he's going to immediately sign an extension with his new team, unless it's a team like Boston or LA, because then I would definitely expect him to re-sign pretty quickly after he does. So it's not just the trade situation, but also the free agency situation. And this is why we love the NBA so much, because things can change so quickly, in this case, literally overnight. And I look forward to continuing to cover this, what is going to be a continually developing Anthony Davis trade situation moving forward. And there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.